All right, everyone. Our apologies for the delay. We appreciate having such a large audience. It took everyone a little while to get through the line. Let's get started. I know our presenters have worked hard and they're eager to share the stories with us. So on behalf of the First Fridays Committee and the Archives and Special Collections Department, welcome to First Fridays. I am Linnea Anderson. I'm the Archivist of the Social Welfare History Archives and a member of the First Fridays Committee. Welcome back to our regular guests, and a special welcome to any who are with us for the first time. And now on a more serious note, we especially send out a warm welcome to those here from the Jewish community as we acknowledge this difficult time in the wake of the tragedy in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue. First Fridays is a monthly series of presentations made possible by a generous gift from Governor Elmer L. Anderson and Mrs. Eleanor Anderson in honor of former library director Dr. Edward B. Stanford. The presentations are based on materials in the University Libraries, Archives, and Special Collections. And this year's theme is We Are Here, Women in the Archives, focusing on female identifying stories. I also want to remind you that we are streaming and that the video will be available later on the University of Minnesota Library's YouTube channel. And also, if you don't have a seat, there are additional seats available up on the third floor in room 308 and live streaming of this event. If you would like to be more comfortable upstairs, we welcome you to go across to the elevator on the opposite side of the building. Go up to the third floor, you'll see the signs for 308, and you can find a seat in there. Today's presentations focus on the Nathan and Teresa Berman Upper Midwest Jewish Archives and the Kautz family YMCA Archives. And lunch today, which arrived in two separate sections, causing a little adventure for those of us on the committee, is from Wally's Falafel, in keeping with our tradition of catering with local businesses. After the program, there will be a tour with Tim Johnson. So if you are interested in taking a tour, please find Tim after the program is over. And before we move on, we have a short announcement from Kirsten Clark about Friends of the Libraries. Thanks, Kirsten.
So I just want to add my welcome as well to a very large and wonderful group. It's great to see you all here. I won't go into a lot of detail because we want to get onto the presentations, but we have some materials about the Friends of the Libraries group as well as some of our specific friends groups around collections. One thing we did want to just mention is we do have an upcoming Friends event that, for those of you that, since we're looking at women in the archives, there's a presentation that's going to be over at Kaufman, Me Too, Momentous or Momentary. And so there's flyers for that at the desk, or I do it again, at the table in the back. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. Our first presentation today is The Miracle of McKinley by Kate Dietrick, Archivist of the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives. In the mid-1960s, the St. Paul chapter of the National Council for Jewish Women spearheaded the first educational program for pre-kindergarten children in Minnesota as part of the War on Poverty. This enterprising effort with underprivileged children at McKinley School set the example for what would become the successful Headstart Program.
Hello, thanks everyone for coming. All right. In the spring of this year, the University of Minnesota's Child Development Center was in the headlines. Talk of closing the center had begun to swirl, despite demonstrated need for an educational and affordable childcare facility on campus. With this topic at the forefront of our minds, I spoke with my Social Welfare History Archives colleague, Linnea Anderson, on possibly sprucing up the display case outside our suite with materials related to the early years of the childcare daycare movement in the 1970s. I tasked my student worker, Erin, to dig through collections to identify materials, and that is how we uncovered the Miracle of McKinley. I knew that the National Council of Jewish Women had undertaken a daycare study in the early 1970s, but before this, I had never known about their mid-1960s pre-kindergarten education project that lay the groundwork for the successful Headstart program. The McKinley Project landed the St. Paul section of the National Council of Jewish Women in the national spotlight. The story that follows is just one of the many tucked in the folders and scrapbooks of the archives. And just a quick note, some of the newspaper articles I will be showing use outdated racial terms prevalent at the time, so be aware of that. Let's first begin with the history of the National Council of Jewish Women and who they are. Founded in 1893, the National Council of Jewish Women, or NCJW, is the oldest women's volunteer organization that has been at the forefront of social change for over a century. Inspired by Jewish values, NCJW takes a progressive stance on issues such as child welfare, women's rights, and reproductive freedom. The St. Paul section is a charter member of NCJW, having also been established in 1893. Through the years, NCJW provided training, education, and shelter for young immigrant women, advocated for child labor laws, arranged child care for immigrant families, and provided services to help the disadvantaged. The St. Paul section often worked in coalition with the Minneapolis section, and in June of 2016, the two sections merged to become NCJW Minnesota. We have a few members of NCJW present here today. I'm equal parts excited to have them, but also terrified that I'm going to get some part of their history wrong. So if I do, please just heckle me later. Women in the United States have a long history of volunteering for various reasons. The time period I'm talking about is the mid-1960s, a time when only around 35 to 40% of women were participating in the labor force in a part-time or full-time capacity. Women that did not work were doing so for various reasons, but many were busy raising families. Some of these women, those who had the luxury to not have to participate in paid labor, spent time volunteering with various organizations. Many women took their volunteer work seriously and with vigor. In Wendy Kamner's book, Women Volunteering, she rightly points out that, quote, "At a time when marriage and motherhood were a woman's only true calling, volunteering was a bold and liberating step out of the home and into a working role in the community. We forget that volunteers were once troublemakers and pioneers." Volunteering during this time was seen as the realm of women, and many times they organized what were seen as women's activities, fundraising using events like galas or teas, or putting on rummage sales or fashion shows. But when you look at the sheer amount of funds that these organizations raised, the power of volunteers was nothing to disregard. In 1965, in the first year of the McKinley Project, the St. Paul section of NCJW had nearly 600 due-paying members, with yearly funds of over $17,000 to allocate to the community, which is around $140,000 in today's dollars. And keep in mind that St. Paul was just one of two sections in the Twin Cities. These women, while not participating in the paid labor force, were still making financial and social differences in the communities and by the work that they were undertaking. So how did the Miracle of McKinley begin? It began with Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty, an initiative he kicked off during his State of the Union address in January of 1964. This was an effort to combat the growing rate of poverty, which at the time hovered around 19%. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 was passed shortly thereafter, one tenet of which was funds for community action programs geared towards eliminating poverty. This initiative was right up the alley of the National Council of Jewish Women. Their mission was, quote, "Through an integrated program of education, service, and social action, NCJW provides essential services and stimulates and educates the individual and the community towards their responsibility in advancing human welfare and the democratic way of life." Furthermore, as we see here, and a quote from the Talmud was also included, "Do not separate thyself from the community's welfare." And so the St. Paul section of NCJW began making plans to start a community action program and do their part in the war on poverty. Their work began with the School for Community Action, a day-long seminar taking place on April 6, 1964, at Mount Zion Temple on Summit Avenue in St. Paul. As you can see from the program, the morning session was on the impact of poverty, the afternoon on community action, and the day featured speakers from the University of Minnesota, United Funding Council, the St. Paul Department of Education, and various educators. The American Jewish World newspaper announced the event as being an opportunity where people could acquaint themselves with the problems of disadvantaged youth and what they could do to help. The school was also mentioned in the St. Paul Dispatch and the Highland Highland Villager, clearly an effort to get a wide audience beyond just the Jewish community. The focus on children in poverty was intentional, the thought being, everyone loves kids, educate them to give them skills to succeed in life. What appears to have risen to the top from the conversations at the day-long seminar was apparent in the May 4th board meeting minutes of St. Paul NCJW, where it states that, quote, the board wholeheartedly recommends that the general membership, out of council's continuing concern for youth, approve in spirit and detail the program being formulated by council and the Department of Education for a preschool in disadvantaged school area. Here, the idea of how to help begins to take shape. The St. Paul Board of Education asked NCJW to put together their proposal on targeting pre-kindergarten age kids with an education program. The proposal was submitted shortly after the seminar in the summer of 1964 to commence in the fall of the 1964 school year and to run a total of 3 years from 1964 to 1967. The program proposal notes that, quote, the St. Paul Council of Jewish Women, acting on advice of its parents group, the National Council of Jewish Women, has taken a project for support, both through financial aid and personnel assistance, the improvement of educational opportunities for children living in disadvantaged areas. The St. Paul Council has offered to support financially the services of a half-time teacher to establish a nursery school for disadvantaged children in one area, to provide funds for field trips, supplies, and equipment, and to support the educational program in the schools through the service as teachers' aides. The goal of the program will be to broaden the background of experiences and to improve verbal skills, two problems which are consistently noted as prevalent in disadvantaged areas. An addendum included the budget and showed that the St. Paul section of NCJW contributed $4,000. If we look at the total budget for NCJW's fiscal year of 1965 to 1966, this $4,000 is double what the second highest disbursement was and much higher than the average cost for other services they donated to. This was a large investment on their behalf. The report later notes the State Department of Education will support this program by paying up to $3,600 towards the teacher's salary. In other words, NCJW paid for over half of this 3-year program at the St. Paul Public School. The idea was that around 100 children would be eligible in the targeted area. Each child would attend 2 sessions per week, and Fridays would be for evaluation meetings. In this proposal, it notes that the pilot project would occur at one school, McKinley Elementary School in St. Paul, located at 485 Carroll Avenue in what we call the Rondo neighborhood. This location was apparently chosen by the school board as the neediest school. The proposal illuminates a bit more on why McKinley was chosen as the place for this educational program to begin. It states, some of the reasons for the selection of this area are, 1, it is an area of high population density. The large old houses have been divided and subdivided. 2, the median grade level of education for adults is from 8.6 to 9.5, one of the lowest in the city. 3, there is a high concentration of racial minorities, primarily Negro. 4, the median family income is the lowest in the city, being from $4,200 to $5,200. 5, the percentage of families receiving public assistance is very high, and on and on. At this point, I want to take just a brief sidestep and talk about the racial dynamics that come into play. Because here it becomes clear that by going to McKinley, we have white people entering into a majority black school, so let's break down the power dynamics a bit. When I spoke to women who were involved with the McKinley project, I asked them, did anyone question this setup of Jewish women going in to teach young black children? And they all said, no. And this could hinge upon a few things. First, the area that McKinley covered was in the Selby Dale area, an area where historically many Jewish families had homes and businesses in this racially diverse community. During the late 1950s and 60s, we begin to see Jewish families moving south to the Highland Park area, but the Jewish presence and relationship to the area where McKinley was remained strong. This time period was also a tumultuous one for Black-Jewish relations. An entire half hour could be dedicated to this topic alone. But what was happening locally and nationally was a coming together of Blacks and Jews surrounding civil rights and social justice, as well as a falling out. There are many great books about this topic, some of which I'll list at the end of my presentation, But what I do want to do is emphasize that it was not uncommon for this time for Jewish communities to support Black communities and the burgeoning civil rights movement. In Paul Berman's Blacks and Jews, Alliances and Arguments, he notes that, quote, between half and 3/4 of the money raised by civil rights organizations at the height of the movement came from Jewish contributors, which is striking considering that Jews made up less than 3% of the American population. Finally, one more thing to point out. During this period, many of the Great Society programs were focused on opportunities for communities of color, placing Jews on the side of whites, the privileged class. For a minority group with a history of persecution to now be placed with the majority in this binary system, perhaps some Jewish guilt came into play as they looked to reach across the divide to help other minority groups. Clearly, this is a complicated relationship that I could go on and on about, but I did want to touch upon the racial aspects of these white Jewish women entering into a predominantly Black elementary school. So, back to McKinley. The St. Paul School Board officially approved the proposal put forth by the St. Paul NCJW on July 22, 1964. And in the fall of 1964, volunteers from the membership of the St. Paul section began the program with the assistance of the appointed teacher, Janice Mader, and support of the new principal, Oscar Trurian. 2 co-chairs were appointed from the NCJW membership, Greta Freeman and Rhoda Redleaf. Rhoda herself was an educator, a professional teacher, and former director of Macalester College's nursery school. Volunteers signed up to give their time, and orientation was then provided to all the women where they were given a crash course in child development. Guidelines were handed out to the volunteers as well, as evidenced here. Number 5 is my favorite. Good grooming is important. Slacks should not be worn. Lest we forget, slacks on women is apparently suspect. Here we have a flyer that is calling for volunteers from the membership. And I'd like to take a moment to focus and break down this flyer because this one document tells so much about this project. First, we have a headline of Help Wanted with a background of Help Wanted ads. But this flyer is Help Wanted for a volunteer position surrounded by ads for paid positions. What do we think this says about the way in which these women approach their volunteer work? Did they see this unpaid labor as just as valuable as paid labor? Were they, quote unquote, just volunteers? Or was this like a job to them? The flyer goes on to say, experience, unnecessary, qualifications, enthusiasm, and a warm heart, rewards, huge. The qualification was kindness. The pay was not monetary, but the feeling of making a difference. It then lists things that they were looking for to outfit the classroom, the first being dolls, Negro especially. Here we see that volunteers are clearly conscious of the fact that a large portion of the students that will be attending are Black. The desire to have Black dolls present for Black children points to one of the curriculum plans for the school, develop positive self-image. The goal states, quote, to create in the child a good feeling about himself, the way he looks, the way he works and plays, his worth as an individual. There was clearly an understanding that the children would benefit from dolls that look like them. I also enjoy the specificity of puppets, dog, tiger, cat, alligator. Like, if they were offered a rooster, would they take it? I don't know why those 4 animals were the ones. I really, really enjoy this flyer. The structure of the McKinley pre-kindergarten program was supported by childhood development studies of the era. There were various objectives: to develop oral language, positive self-image, child's auditory and visual discrimination, social skills, personal habits, optimal opportunity to develop physically, and give the child firsthand experience through field trips. The schedule shows that various field trips were undertaken to the airport, the university farm, the St. Paul Public Library, and an unspecified museum. The schedule for the day shows the morning and afternoon groups with activity period, cleanup, snack time, singing activity, rest time, games, walks, outdoor play, and story time. For many 4-year-olds with limited backgrounds, this was all a very new experience with learning at the center. At the October 5th, 1964 St. Paul section meeting, it was noted that there were 64 children enrolled in the 4 different sessions. By the October 28th meeting, co-chair Greta Freeman thanked the 40 volunteers and noted that Principal Trurian said, "The women have inspired the faculty and children." She also noted that since the program had started, quote, "The first PTA at McKinley had the largest they ever had with 82 parents in attendance." This is the thing that Greta and Rhoda repeatedly stressed in another goal of the pre-K program, parental involvement. In a later report, they wrote in all caps, "If the children are not encouraged and motivated in their homes, then we will surely lose the luster of any success we might encounter along the way." Parents coming to a PTA meeting in droves only 2 months in was just the beginning of the success of the program. The project was clearly off to a great start. The children were engaged and learning, the parents became involved and interested, and attention came flooding in almost immediately. Newspapers from the American Jewish World to the Minneapolis Tribune to the Pioneer Press wrote about McKinley. Various local organizations reached out to learn how the project was structured. But more than that, the project gained national recognition and influence. Let's again look back at what is happening on a national level that prompted this project to begin: the Economic Opportunity Act and the Office of Economic Opportunity's Community Action Program. In late 1964, as the McKinley Project began, a group of people in Washington were getting together to create the Headstart Program, which would launch in 1965. As Edward Siegler wrote in The Hidden History of Head Start, quote, "Despite the long history of intervention programs for poor children prior to Head Start, most were run by charities, social reformers, individuals, and private groups with a mission or calling. The growing child study movement did not infiltrate these programs to the point that practice could be linked to child outcomes. In other words, little was known about the effectiveness of these programs or even about the dynamics of what went on in them in a day-to-day basis. When the planners met to design Head Start, they had very little scientific evidence to guide them." Because this is Minnesota, here's the part of the presentation where Hubert H. Humphrey comes in. Knowing that Vice President Humphrey was involved in issues of education and anti-poverty, writer Irvin Ruddick of the Minneapolis Star and Tribune wrote to Humphrey to tell him about what he coined the Miracle of McKinley School. Irvin spoke of the impact and structure of this successful project and suggested if Humphrey was interested in more information, he could reach out to the two co-chairs, Greta Freeman and Rhoda Redleaf. Humphrey writes back, "My dear friend," and thanks Irvin for writing. The same day, he reaches out to Greta to learn more. What's interesting is that Irvin is actually Greta's father. I just love this idea of like dad writing the vice president, talking about like all the great things his daughter is doing. This is great. And so, in January of 1965, the St. Paul section of the National Council of Jewish Women sent a 9-page report to Vice President Humphrey, as well as to Hyman Bookbinder of the Office of Economic Opportunity. Again, these are the people involved in putting together the Head Start program, with little evidence of how existing programs should work. And the St. Paul section is giving them the outline of the McKinley Project to help them as they structure Head Start. The report itself is rather dry. It shares information on McKinley's facilities, the schedule of the day, and the progress the children have made as reported by parents. But at the end of the report, it has what I find the most interesting part. They write, quote, "The one problem we have encountered is the term disadvantaged, and others like it which are offensive to our parents. The repercussions have been few, but even those few hurt and can multiply. We realize it is solely a matter of semantics, and we have tried to use children of limited backgrounds wherever it may apply. I'm sure that the feeling across the country is the same, but what we can do to improve the coined vocabulary is difficult. Raising the self-image of our McKinley families is a vital concern to us, and in speaking of our parents, we always try to keep this uppermost in our minds. As the national government was planning Head Start, the St. Paul section urged them to remember that words matter and that people should be treated with dignity no matter their situation in life." The National Council of NCJW was most interested in what was happening in St. Paul and reached out numerous times. St. Paul members attended the NCJW National Conference in New York in March 1965, which featured Sergeant Shriver from the Office of Economic Opportunity and leader of the Head Start program. Shriver called out the St. Paul section's work and again used the phrase, "Miracle of McKinley," in speaking about their groundbreaking progress in their educational program. The October 1965 issue of the National NCJW publication showcases McKinley along with other NCJW-organized programs around the country. It explicitly states, quote, St. Paul's successful experience may well have also affected the entire National Headstart Program, for both Vice President Humphrey and the Anti-Poverty Director Sergeant Shriver's offices asked for reports on its progress while writing federal legislation, which has now made Headstart an ongoing year-round project. Here in the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives, we have, of course, only one side of this story, the St. Paul story. I'd love to someday go to the National Archives and dig through the materials of the Office of Economic Opportunity to see just how much the McKinley Project impacted the planning of Headstart. The 1964 school year at McKinley was a success. In the remaining 2 years of the 3-year program, the children attending increased, the number of volunteers involved increased, and the impact continued. For example, after 1 year's attendance, the children showed an average increase of 12 to 13 IQ points based on testing. Parents spoke to behavioral changes, and kindergarten teachers noted how those who were involved in the pre-K program did indeed seem to have a leg up. The Headstart program itself was launched in the state of Minnesota in 1965. Greta and Rhoda went to the week-long statewide Headstart orientation at the University of Minnesota. They attended to learn while also presenting their experience in seminars and sitting on panels discussing their progress. They were both asked to be on the Headstart Advisory Committee and continued speaking about the program to the League of Women Voters, the State Department of Welfare, and to church groups and community center meetings. But other things were happening in St. Paul at the time that would affect the story of McKinley. The St. Paul Board of Education conducted a report from the Committee on Racial Imbalance at the St. Paul Public Schools, known as the CRISP report. The report, quote, suggested changing school district lines to end de facto segregation, construction of new schools in locations convenient for both white and Negro students, and broader programs of cultural enrichment for children of poorer backgrounds. As one headline in the Minneapolis Tribune asked, is racial concentration harmful to education? It notes that, quote, Negro leaders feel that the concentration of Negroes in 3 schools, one of which is McKinley, should be reduced, and that NAACP is preparing a lawsuit in its New York office to force the school board to take action. The article points out the preschool at McKinley run by St. Paul NCJW as a way to help the struggling community, but then quotes the national NAACP office saying, these efforts amount to doing nothing, as the NAACP instead wanted more focus on integration. By May of 1965, the second year of the McKinley Miracle, closing the school entirely was backed by the school board, quote, as means of achieving racial balance in schools. Finally, on June 21st, 1967, the headline read, predominantly Negro school closed by St. Paul Board. With no discussion, the board unanimously voted to close the school. The article goes on to say, quote, pupils reassigned by the board would be transported to other schools at the expense of the public. Thus begins a different era of education in the St. Paul School District, one of integrated busing. Here's what it looks like currently at 485 Carroll Avenue, where McKinley once stood. The 3-year pilot pre-K education program at McKinley was itself successful, despite the closure of the school. Children were given a boost, and a roadmap for others was drawn. In 1967, the St. Paul section of NCJW celebrated their 3 years of progress at McKinley in their bulletin. The cover depicts a flower with all the petals being programs that they undertook. McKinley is at the center. It notes that 150 women gave 6,000 hours of time to help children. Rhoda and Greta thanked the volunteers, saying, quote, we only hope and pray that in some way we have touched the lives of our McKinley children so that their future may hold greater hope for them. Principal Truian wrote his thanks, saying, the philosophy and attitude of this group was very impressive to me. They spoke of service to the community, and they really meant it. The St. Paul NCJW section, of course, continued with their various social service projects, including their continued work with children and education. After McKinley, they began a supplementary reading program at Drew Elementary School in West Frogtown. They played an active role in the formation of the Greater St. Paul Council for Coordinated Childcare. And in 1979, the section was asked by the St. Paul schools to develop a curriculum for Hmong refugees arriving in St. Paul. The Teaching Language Communication Program worked with students for whom English was a second language. The group remains active, now known as NCJW Minnesota, and is celebrating their 125th year. The projects they undertake are true to years past, focusing on social justice advocacy, community service, and leadership development. And the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives will be here, continuing to archive that history, waiting for someone else to find other miracles in the scrapbooks. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Our second presentation today is She Served by Alex Bentley, Archivist for the YMCA of the Greater Twin Cities. Between 1917 and 1919, more than 3,400 women went to work for the YMCA in France to improve the lives of the soldiers who had gone overseas. As a group and as individuals, they had a tremendous impact on the YMCA and on the soldiers that they served.
So in the early morning on November 11th, 1918, in the forest of Compiègne, an agreement was finally reached between the Allied powers and Germany to stop fighting later that day at 11 a.m. Paris time. This November 11th is the 100th anniversary of that first Armistice Day that ended the fighting in the Great War. My colleagues in the Kautz Family YMCA Archives thought it was important for us to recognize this milestone anniversary because our collection has significant holdings related to World War I. In the YMCA archives, we have hundreds of boxes of material related to World War I. We have reports and correspondence, scrapbooks, photographs, papers of individuals, books, YMCA uniforms, helmets, dog tags, and more. All of the information about our holdings is available in a new guide on the YMCA and World War I on our website. Please check it out. And our collection has this significant amount of material because we collect the records of the YMCA, and the YMCA's involvement in World War I was significant. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, entering the war on the side of France and Great Britain and losing its status as a neutral nation. On that same day, John Mott, the General Secretary of the International Committee of the YMCA, sent a telegram to President Wilson offering the full services of the association movement. Later that month, President Wilson formally accepted the offer. He issued an order recognizing the YMCA as a valuable adjunct and asset to their service, and he gave the Y an official standing as a partner in their war effort. By June, the first 27 YMCA secretaries left for France to join other American Y men who had already been working in Europe. From 1917 to 1919, nearly 26,000 men and women were employed by the Y to provide services that would improve the lives of soldiers. YMCA secretaries organized countless recreation, entertainment, and religious activities, and they operated thousands of canteens and YMCA huts. About half of the 26,000 served overseas, and of that half that served overseas, nearly 3,500 were women. And so that's the part of the story that I'd like to share today, how nearly 3,500 American women went overseas to improve the lives of soldiers under the banner of the YMCA. I'll tell a little bit about their story from a higher level organizational perspective, and then zoom in to tell a little more detailed story of the impact of just one of those women who served. For those of you who don't know, the YMCA does stand for the Young Men's Christian Association, and was mostly an organization of and for men for much of its history. So how did so many women get involved with the YMCA during World War I? According to the book, Service with Fighting Men, the canteen door was the first one opened to women by the YMCA. In June of 1917, Helen Astor, one of America's wealthiest and most well-known women, followed her husband overseas after he joined the Navy. She offered her services to the YMCA and was put in charge of a canteen for sailors in Brest, a city on the western tip of France. In July, Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of Theodore Roosevelt Jr., opened the first YMCA canteen in Paris. These two were the first of what would ultimately be those 3,500 American women working for the Y overseas. Because the first American canteens with women were a success, and the British YMCA had had a solid and longer record of women serving in their Ys, by August of 1917, a message from the YMCA offices in Paris stated that it was the unanimous opinion there that qualified women for canteen work were necessary. One of the first qualified women found was Dr. Marguerite Crockett. She'd been an ambulance driver for the French Army before the US had entered the war, and was specially recruited by the YMCA to be one of the first women to wear their YMCA uniform and start a canteen. So Dr. Crockett literally wrote the book on how to run a canteen for the YMCA. She wrote this handbook after opening the first YMCA wet canteen in the field for the American Expeditionary Forces in September. Although she prefaced the book by saying that it only represented the limited experiences of a small group of workers, and that it was just offered with the hope that it might be helpful to new workers, and that it was by no means intended to be a complete handbook of YMCA activities, it was one of the few available how-to books for women doing this work. By November of 1917, a corps of volunteers was busy at home in New York, selecting candidates from among the women who were applying to serve in the Y, and to join the more than 150 YMCA women who were already at work in France. While recruitment was initially very focused on women's Eastern colleges, as news spread that women workers were needed, the number of candidates greatly increased. And they came from all over the country. By April of 1918, applications were coming to the women's division at the Y at the rate of 300 per week, and by July, that number had risen to 1,200 per week. Although I'm not sure entirely how many women applied overall, between men and women, there were reportedly more than 200,000 applications for YMCA work abroad. In this pamphlet from April of 1918 called War Work of Women in Colleges, it presented a wide variety of opportunities for war work for women, both at home and abroad, in government and relief work. So this page shows an entry for canteens, right after opportunities in aviation and Americanization work, and right before work as chauffeurs, clerks, and dietitians. For YMCA canteens, the description is quite brief. Candidates must be between the ages of 30 and 45. Under no circumstances will anyone under 26 years of age be considered. No salaries are paid. The exact requirements and limitations for who was selected to go changed throughout the war. Initially, that desired age range was 30 to 45. The age was lowered to 25, and after the Armistice, it was lowered again to 23. Although 45 was the suggested upper age limit, older women went too. In addition to the age requirements, at first government regulations made any woman ineligible for overseas service if she had a husband, a father, a son, or a brother in the military or working abroad. Eventually, women with brothers in the military could go, but only if they signed a pledge not to try to visit their brothers under any circumstances, including if they became wounded. In addition to these basic restrictions, the Y had many more important and essential qualifications regarding the type of woman that they would accept into their service. In this pamphlet, John Mott of the YMCA War Work Council is quoted as saying, The women selected for overseas service should be the choicest spirits among the women of America. They should be women of social gifts and graces, of established Christian character, of sound health, capable of enduring great strain. They should believe with all of their souls in the cause of the United States and her allies. They should possess quiet, undiscourageable enthusiasm, and above all, should have the capacity of bringing cheer and comfort to men in the face of the great realities involved in devotion, even unto death, to a great cause. In another report, the qualities were described this way. Our women workers must not only have experience, ability, and initiative, but must have a cheerful, encouraging outlook on life, an unselfish willingness to cooperate, a sincere spirit of service. The woman who can make homemade pie has her real value in the hut. As those who can sing and drive a car or entertain have theirs. But the woman who can give by her presence the feeling of home, a bit of encouragement, a helping hand, is the woman we seek for our huts overseas. Knowledge of French was also beneficial. But during the interview, asking too much about what different places you might be able to visit in France and when your first vacation would be was disqualifying. Carefully vetting candidates and ensuring that they had all of these necessary personal qualifications for Y work seems to have worked out well for the Y. In doing this research, I found that there was much written about the wonderful work that these women did. Both during and after the war, when the YMCA's service record was investigated, the work the women had done was always very highly praised. In Howard Hopkins' History of the YMCA in North America, he wrote, "No criticism was ever leveled against the women who served in association uniform. Not subject to the draft, they represented a higher caliber of personality than on the whole was available to the YMCA among the men who offered their services." Another said, "Women as a rule were more aggressive and hardworking than the men. They were more cheerful and optimistic and did not become so irritable under the strain." General C.P. Summerall, a commander of the 1st Infantry Division in World War I, said that sending the women was the crowning achievement of all of the association's considerable work during the war. So I started to lose a little bit of interest, to be honest, with this narrative line. While the work that these women did was impressive, and it was certainly an interesting moment, it got old for me to keep reading about how all of the women overseas were credits to the highest ideals of American womanhood and other similar generic and overblown compliments. So I started looking for the stories of individual women who served overseas, and especially reading some of the books written by the women themselves about their time working for the Y in France. And there are quite a lot, such as The Uncensored Letters of a Canteen Girl, A Red Triangle Girl in France, A Y Girl in France, That Damn Y, My AEF, Canteening Overseas, The Big Show, and Two Colored Women with the American Expeditionary Forces, to name just a few. Although each woman was a part of the 3,500 women that were sent overseas, and they were all with the Y, their stories differ significantly because of the variability of the work across different parts of France and the different types of roles that these women had, and also their individuality as people with very different lived experiences. For example, Canteening Overseas by Marion Baldwin was about her experiences stationed at a leave area canteen. Janice Elsie's The Big Show, My 6 Months with the AEF, was about work entertaining the troops. Elsie was a very famous actress, and she was the most famous person among more than 1,400 entertainers that were sent overseas to work for the Y. In Two Colored Women with the American Expeditionary Forces, Addie Hunton and Katherine Johnson wrote about their experiences as the second and third of just a handful of African-American female secretaries sent to France to serve more than 200,000 African-American troops. But the person's story that I became the most interested in was Emma Young Dixon. Her papers, including her diary and letters during her time in France, are here in the archives. Her story really interested me and made me see that what had sounded like over-the-top admiration expressed for all of the Y women overseas that I talked about earlier may have in fact been well-deserved praise, and it definitely was in Emma's case. Emma Young Dixon was born in 1891. Her father was the first vice president of the U.S. Steel Corporation, and he resigned because of his support for labor and support of a more humane work week for steel workers. And he moved his family to New Jersey and started a different steel company that became the third largest in the United States during World War I. Her family was rich. Emma's daughter later recalled that Emma had herself described this pre-war period of her life as very carefree, and that she was just a social butterfly driving her friends to parties and cruising around in her Stutz Roadster. From the records, we can tell that that's not entirely accurate. She had been a serious volunteer and worked for the Red Cross as early as 1915. Probably because of that connection, she knew very early on that the YMCA was looking for women to serve overseas. She applied twice to do canteen work for the Y and was accepted on the second try. So she arrived in France in April of 1918 when she was 26. We know a little bit about what drove her to come to France and what the work for her at the canteen was like from a speech she gave at the dedication of the first YMCA hut that she helped start that May. She said, "In the town where I live, almost every house has a service flag in the window, showing how many men from that home have gone out to fight for the freedom of the world. And every time I saw one of those flags, I wished that I too had been a man to have a small part in this great conflict. But being just a girl, the only way I could help was rolling eternally long bandages for the Red Cross." Then the YMCA accepted me, rather reluctantly, I admit, to come over here and do canteen work. I don't wonder now that they hesitated about sending me, for it's a much bigger job than I ever dreamed it would be, and I feel very incompetent measured up beside it. You know, it isn't only selling chocolates and cigarettes, it's doing 1,000 little things that your own mothers and sisters would do for you if they only had a chance, like sewing on buttons, cheering you up or scolding you, whichever you need most, and giving you hot chocolate when it's cold and rainy. So if you have any suggestions to offer, I wish you'd be perfectly frank in asking me to do things for you, even to helping you read your love letters or parlez-vousing français. In a letter describing her work to her mother, she said, "This is wonderful work that they're doing over here. I have a different point of view already, and I'm sure that I'll come back a much better person. I'm gladder every day that I've had this opportunity." And later, "I'm getting so independent, you won't recognize me when I come home." Despite repeated assurances to her family that she was perfectly safe, she was actually attached to the 3rd Division of the 7th Infantry and seemed to be near all of the major battles along the Western Front that summer and fall. Her experiences were summed up to her as follows: to pass through the great German barrage of July 15th, to be present at the lip of the awful crater that the Germans formed to annihilate the Army of America at Chateau Thierry, to be able to say you were in advance of this regiment the morning of the opening blast of American activity at San Miguel, the first effort of the U.S. Army as a whole unit, and then to comfort the men in the regiment went to Madeline Farm, the apex of an inferno in the Argonne, is something very few living people can duplicate. Because of this proximity to the fighting, she spent a lot of time in hospitals and provided some of her most important services to the wounded and the dying. Emma got her first experience of what hospital work was like in June, just 3 months after arriving in France. As she wrote in a report to her supervisor, she said, "My courage almost gave out that first day. I wrote many letters for our 3rd Division soldiers. One with a bullet through his chest dictated a beautiful letter to his wife, so full of tenderness and faith that everything would turn out for the best, that my pen could hardly write the words. In her diary here, she wrote that she could hardly get out of the hospital fast enough and exclaimed, "What a poor nurse I would make." Despite that feeling, she and her fellow YMCA worker returned the next day, and Emma wrote again, "Hundreds of wounded, what pathetic sights, whole faces and arms shot away." In addition to the hospital work, she and Helen still did have their regular canteen duties as well, the work of getting water, making the hot chocolate, selling items, chatting with the boys, and playing music for them. Hospital work was done in her spare time. And despite the busyness of canteen life, they did make time for it. And despite not feeling like she was up to the task, Emma kept coming back. She wrote to her mother, "Today I was going through a ward of gas wounded, and one man got up on his elbow and said, 'My God, here's an American girl, the first I've seen for months.' He was still hoarse and his eyes all inflamed, but he insisted that I come over and shake hands so he could see I was real. This shows just how much they appreciate us just walking through the wards. All we can do is smile and kid them along, and for a moment they forget how much it hurts." In mid-July, Emma was near the front during the Second Battle of the Marne. The male secretaries were at the front, and so Emma and her coworker Helen closed their canteen and reported to the field hospital. Emma was cited for this work, and her and Helen's contributions were noted specifically. The citation said, "The young women of the YMCA were detailed to the hospitals, and the medical staff of this division bear testimony of their most efficient help during these 2 weeks of great strain. The conduct of those self-sacrificing and brave men and women who have so unhesitantly given their services to their country establishes a standard of prestige, exceptional courage, devotion, and resource, which the commanding general particularly commends." The battle was still going on, and so she was sent on vacation since the army was still pushing towards the German front. While on vacation, Emma had time to write her mother and reflected, "The more I hear about people's jobs, the more thankful I am that I fell in with the 3rd Division. The work is so varied and exciting." She did think about coming home, but she said, "I'm afraid now that I've had a taste of the work, I would be restless and discontent to settle down again rolling bandages." And so she stayed. She returned to the canteen only to find herself very close to the fighting again. Again, she was sent to a field hospital, and again, she received a citation for her work. In the Battle of the Argonne, in which the 3rd Division was actively engaged for 31 days, the entire personnel of the YMCA rendered a service to our men on the front line, which, though not of a combatant nature, made easier the task of our combatant troops. The young ladies in particular faced hardship and danger with a cheerfulness and spirit well worth the traditions of our American women. Nothing could have been finer than this performance of duty. The entire division is proud of its YMCA representatives. From the general. After the Armistice, Emma did stay with the 3rd Division and traveled through Luxembourg and on to Germany. She returned home in March of 1919. What I find remarkable in her story is that she was just a typical woman who rose to meet extraordinary challenges. As her YMCA supervisor put it to her, "Day by day, you measured up to your highest responsibilities and ever kept before you the one purpose for which you came to France, to lift up the lives of our boys. When the cruel German offensive began and our wounded were brought in literally by the hundreds, your time of testing came. But you've been given strength to keep your courage. As day by day you've passed through the wards, you've brought cheer and comfort with which no words can express. You've had the last words with those who have gone west, as you've said it in soldier language, and your letters back to the loved ones at home have brought immeasurable comfort which no man could possibly give. I rejoice in your work and your service and your sacrifice more than you will ever know. It's been an inspiration to me to work with you." This punch card has information about Emma's background that led her to the YMCA and is the Cliff Notes version of her YMCA service. Although Emma's experiences were remarkable, she's just one of the 3,500 women that worked for the YMCA in France. Just one of the 26,000 women and men who served the Y both at home and overseas. Each one of these has their own punch card containing their own biographical data and unique record of contributions to the war effort. The YMCA has launched an online project to decode these YMCA punch cards and to learn the history of all YMCA World War I secretaries, and in doing so, uncover the full story of the Y in World War I. There are more remarkable individuals like Emma whose stories need to be remembered again. Join the project and help us uncover their hidden histories. We can't do it without you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you to our presenters. We do not have time for questions today. I do have a few quick announcements. We have a couple of exhibits in the building that we invite you to see. Festival, Spectacle, and Celebration in the Early Modern World on the ground floor in the Maxine Wallen Center in room 15. And It's Such a Big Dream, I Can't See It All, an exhibition on the life and work of photographer Edward S. Curtis in our main gallery on the first floor and also in the second and third floors. And there will be a film screening here on Monday at 6, a tribal justice film screening in relation to this exhibit that you might find interesting. And finally, the Allen Mackler 221B sitting room is making its way from Wilson Library over to Anderson Library. It is almost complete, and if you're curious and would like to take a peek, we welcome you to go up to the second floor and into the space where the offices are located. You can look through the window and see the sitting room in 221B Baker Street. And a shout out to Darren Terpstra, our Archives and Special Collections exhibit designer, for his usual stellar work to create that space. So we welcome you back again on December 7th for presentations from the Charles Babbage Institute Archives and the Social Welfare History Archives. Thanks everyone for coming today.